The assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth led to widespread mourning in the United States. But what's often neglected is the international reaction to the assassination, which is what I want to explore. There are two things to note about Lincoln's assassination. The first is just how shocking it was. The 20th century was an era that was shaped by assassinations as much as anything else. That of Franz Ferdinand in 1914, of Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, of John F. Kennedy in 1963, of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, of RFK just a few months later in the same year, of Anwar Sadat in 1981, of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and so many more. The public was surprised whenever a figure was assassinated, but it eventually became, sad to say, passé. In contrast, the 19th century was no stranger to political violence, but successful assassinations were rare. The second is how quickly everyone found out about it. It was just a few decades before that news traveled at the speed of a horse or ship. But thanks to the invention of the telegraph in 1844, news could travel quickly by wire. News that would take months to travel before would only take weeks and in some cases days or even minutes. It would still take some time for news to make it across the Atlantic, but in the US it spread quickly. International outpouring of condolences were significant, so much so that the Department of State published a volume that contains more than 1,000 pages of condolences from world leaders, government officials, papers, and people from every corner of the globe, from Austria to Venezuela. The London Evening Standard captured the impact and the horror of the assassination. Quote, "The blow is sudden, horrible, irretrievable. Never since the death of Henry IV by the hands of Ravaillac, never perhaps since the assassination of Caesar, has a murder been committed more momentous in its bearing upon the times." End quote. The United Kingdom had remained neutral in the war. The Confederacy found some support with Britain's upper class, which makes sense. It's not for nothing that the planter class has also been known as the Southern aristocracy. The slave owner class had adopted mannerisms and cultural affects that were similar to British nobility and gentry, from how they spoke and dressed to how they behaved with others. One American diplomat reported that some were, quote, "unable to restrain the expression of exultation at the news," end quote. The revolutions of 1848 were only a scant decade and a half in the past, and anti-democratic sentiment was still high. The middle and lower classes, however, identified more with the Union. The workers' support of the Union cause was resolute. Even during an economic downturn in England, some cotton workers refused to process American-origin cotton on principle. The Free Trade Hall in Manchester supported Lincoln, and even wrote to him during the Civil War, on the eve of the publication of the Emancipation Proclamation. In Manchester and Liverpool, stock exchanges were halted on news of the assassination. The sentiment was mirrored in other countries. American diplomats across the world had reported how, as the news spread, people would gather and talk about the fallen president. The U.S. minister to Chile wrote that, quote, "The effect upon the residents of Santiago and Valparaiso was sad beyond description," end quote, and that, quote, "strong men wandered about the streets, weeping like children, and foreigners, unable to speak our language, manifested a grief almost as deep as our own," end quote. Sympathy also came easily to Italy and Germany. Both countries at the time were entertaining or locked in battles for their unification. Italy would reach totality in 1871, after the capture of Rome in 1870 and the movement of the capital from Florence to Rome in 1871. German unification would arrive in the same year. Citizens in both countries expressed a similar appreciation for Lincoln. A tiny Sicilian fishing town shared the Chilean sentiment, saying, quote, "Abraham Lincoln was not yours only, he was also ours, because he was a brother whose great mind and fearless conscience guided a people to union and courageously uprooted slavery," end quote. The Prussian House of Deputies issued a statement that read, quote, "You are aware that Germany has looked with pride and joy on the thousands of her sons who, in this stage, have placed themselves so resolutely on the saw of law and right," end quote. This was more than mere sentiment. Some members of the House of Deputies had sons that were serving in the war on the Union side, and at least one had lost a son in Petersburg. In Ecuador, officers and employees of the government were ordered to wear mourning clothes for 3 days, during which time the flags would also be flown at half-mast. Ecuadorian President Gabriel Garcia Moreno had strong words about the assassination, expressing his shock that, quote, the noble country of Washington would be humiliated by such a black and horrible crime, end quote, and that Lincoln, of all people, would die in such a way, quote, after having served his country with such wisdom and glory under so critical circumstances, end quote. La Opinion, a newspaper from Bogota, Colombia, also penned a tribute. It began by saying that Lincoln wasn't a great man, that is, in the context of the great man theory, and that he didn't have great achievements in war, and that he wasn't a conqueror. Rather, the paper said that he had characteristics that, quote, earthly glory cannot equal. He was the instrument of God, end quote. The author continued to say that Lincoln was, quote, the liberator and savior of the great republic of modern times. That irresistible force called an idea seized upon an obscure and almost common man, burnt him with its holy fire, purified him in its crucible, and raised him to the apex of human greatness, even to being redeemer of a whole race of men, end quote. Chilean President Jose Joaquin Perez mentioned Lincoln in his annual message to the Chilean Congress, saying, quote, nor have we been indifferent to the mourning in which the United States of America have been plunged by the death of their illustrious ruler, Abraham Lincoln. This melancholy event has awakened throughout the country and in the government manifestations of grief and sympathy as just as sincere, end quote. The French paper L'Epoque published a tribute in which they honor Lincoln for his fair prosecution of the war, saying that he, quote, conquered without ever departing from the Republican forms, without one single infraction of the laws of his country, end quote. The same paper continued to compare him favorably to Washington. They ended their tribute with a note on the words John Wilkes Booth yelled after his shot, quote, when his assassin took flight, he is said to have exclaimed, Sic semper tyrannis. God grant that the American government may never have any other but such tyrants as he, end quote. Another Frenchman, Oscar de Lafayette, son of George Washington de Lafayette and grandson of the legendary Marquis de Lafayette, expressed his condolences on May 2, 1865, writing, quote, I hope you will excuse me for addressing you this little note, but you will certainly think it natural that a member of the Lafayette family should wish to join the citizens of the United States in their mourning, end quote. The Republicans of Lyon wanted to let Americans know that, quote, in France they have brothers who appreciate their patriotic efforts and like them love liberty and understand the power of institutions that resist assassinations and oppose conspiracies, end quote, and that they wished that Lincoln's glorious name would, quote, become the pledge of allegiance between the American Republic and the democracies of Europe. In the same vein, Etienne Hanu expressed his hopes on behalf of all the youth in France that, quote, we must not be concerned, we are sure, in spite of what has happened, in spite of traitor Davis, whose malign influence has been exercised by the great and good man, that the patriotic idea of a country in peril, the idea of Grant, Sheridan, and Sherman, supported by liberty, will finish the work begun by Abraham Lincoln, end quote. The residents of Lahaina in the Hawaiian Islands expressed that they, quote, weep together with the Republic of America for the murder, the assassination of the great, the good, the liberator, Abraham Lincoln, the victim of hell-born treason, himself martyred, yet live his mighty deeds, victory, peace, and the emancipation of those despised, like all of us, of the colored races, end quote. Others noted that Lincoln, quote, himself a laborer, he took up the fight for the rights of free labor and carried it to a triumphant termination, end quote, and that the U.S. flag will represent, quote, the cause of freedom and civilization wherever it flies, end quote. The Lodge of the Friends of the Perfect Union, a French Masonic lodge, penned a note to First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, saying that, quote, Lincoln is now surrounded by a halo of glory that ages can never efface. His name will be forever blessed, end quote. The lodge, along with others, had considered Lincoln one of them, thanks to how he displayed the qualities espoused by Freemasons: faith, hope, charity, and a sense of equality. They honored Lincoln effusively, draping their lodges in black, wearing black armbands, staging funeral processions, and firing salvos in tribute. Queen Victoria also penned a similar, much more intimate letter to the widowed First Lady. The two had never met before, but she had a sense of what Mary was feeling. Victoria had lost her husband, Prince Albert, just a few years prior. Her note read that, quote, no one can better appreciate than I can, who am myself utterly broken-hearted by the loss of my own beloved husband, who was the light of my life, my stay, my all, what your own sufferings must be, and I earnestly pray that you may be supported by him, to whom alone the sorely stricken can look for comfort in the hours of heavy affliction." End quote. Some of the upper crust were less concerned with the outcome of the war vis-a-vis slavery, but were concerned about a return to order in the United States. In a letter from Count Meisenberg to Baron Weidenbruck of Austria, Meisenberg expressed his hope that the assassination, quote, "will not bring about any change in the conciliatory interests of the American government," end quote, and that the Union could get back to the business of governing. Similar hopes were expressed by Prince Kung of China, who was shocked by the assassination as much as anyone, but was glad to see that, quote, "on the same day, the vice president succeeded to the position without any disturbance, and that the assassin had been arrested, so that the affairs of government were going on quietly as usual." Thoughts on Lincoln were extended from notable figures as much as anyone else. Giuseppe Garibaldi, a key figure in Italian unification, was a strong supporter of the Union cause and emancipation, and had spent some time in exile in the U.S. Upon reading the Emancipation Proclamation, he penned a letter full of praise to Lincoln, saying that, quote, "Posterity will call you the great emancipator, a more enviable title than any crown could be, and greater than any merely mundane treasure," end quote, and that, quote, "we are sadly reminded how this old Europe, which also can boast of a great cause of liberty to fight for, has not yet found the mind or heart to equal you," end quote. The Working Men's International Association sent a letter attributed to Karl Marx to Andrew Johnson, where they expressed their shock and horror at the assassination and castigated those who were committed to the, quote, "Sisyphus work of morally assassinating Abraham Lincoln and the great republic he headed," end quote, and hailed Lincoln as, quote, "one of the rare men who succeeded in becoming great without ceasing to be good," end quote. Lincoln was, at the time, a more controversial figure than he is today. The man that's considered either the best or the second best president in historical rankings was, in his own time, much more divisive. His assassination led to some celebration in the South and even in the North, particularly among the anti-Lincoln Copperheads. George Young, an American businessman that was in Cairo, Illinois at the time, wrote that, quote, "One rebel wretch expressed great pleasure at the sad news, and said that he was glad of it, and that it ought to have been done long ago. But he had his last exultation. He was shot on the spot," end quote. But the nation, for the most part, was in mourning. He was, after all, a phenomenal leader, and perhaps America's greatest wartime president. Unlike FDR, America's other great wartime president, Lincoln had to deal with internal strife of the highest magnitude. Congress was divided, his citizens were killing each other over keeping millions in bondage, and it seemed that the Union could end at any moment. The preamble to the Constitution reads, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." There was never a time, before or after, when the Union was closer to dissolving. Lincoln held it together and paid the ultimate price. It only makes sense that the international outpouring was so great. America and the world had lost one of the eminent statesmen of the 19th century, the last casualty of America's bloodiest war.
Shall we stop this bleeding?